Good morning. I want to talk a little bit today about police reform. It doesn't do much good to reform the police unless you have a good critique of what is wrong with it. And what's wrong is structural. It's not that you have bad policemen or good policemen, or not even bad criminals or good criminals, which is actually the case. But we got to look at the culture. And the police have got a definite culture, a definite subculture, and Band-Aid reforms aren't going to work unless you look at the totality of how the system works and how it changed and what caused these changes and what were the effects of these changes. And nobody's really doing that. Right now, the police view themselves as protectors of the people or property rather than as custodians of the community, custodians of the mores and the folkways and the value system and things like that of the community. So what we have is a situation since one of our presidents said we're going to have war on crime, we have a wartime footing. And let's go back to the various wars we've had in the past. You first off identify the enemy and then you demonize him. So in World Wars I and II, Germans were demonized. They weren't Germans anymore. They were Krauts, Nazis, etc. The Japanese in World War II were called derogatory names, differentiating them from humankind. So because they were different and identified as different and demonized, they were easy to shoot, kill, and destroy, because they became an enemy. Now, the police have really disassociated themselves with the general public, and in doing so have changed the concept of policing and the identity of the police. What the police do now is they refer to anybody that's not police, not a citizen or the community or whatever, they refer to them as civilians. So this is a problem of the militarization, because when you have militarization, you have enemies, and the people become enemies because they lost sight of the presumption of innocence, and their job is now to protect and not mediate. It's to stop crime and punish crime and keep the barbaric enemies out there from the good people of whatever their friendship group might be. And we have a lot of casualties in this war, particularly in the drug war, but I'll do a few lecture series on that. But right now, just a few examples. Because of the war on crime, you got the specialists, you have special prosecutors, etc. When I first started practicing, they had court-appointed attorneys and prosecutors, even in Chicago, where I went to law school, had prosecutors that could practice part-time. That was a good thing. The specialization came later, and I don't know if that was such a good thing or not. But if you have a lawyer that's a prosecutor, and he occasionally has a client out there at a real estate closing or a will or something like that, he becomes more a part of the community and understands the community maybe a little bit better and knows what the standards and mores are. He's not the type that's going to go off and shoot a mouse with a cannon like we're seeing nowadays. The other problem is, ever since they privatized and commercialized things, there's been great changes. For instance, in Colorado, they had a reform for civil service wages and reform for judicial wages and things like this. When I first started practicing, judges were older lawyers that had successfully completed a law practice or were successfully in a law practice, but they weren't government employees. One was a former trust officer in a bank when I started. Another one was a land title officer. They had various experience in the legal profession and also in the community. A lot of them belonged to Masonic lodges, Rotary clubs, Elks clubs, public service clubs, things like this that you don't see prosecutors belonging to anymore. And the same goes for policemen. When I first started, the police were more integrated into the community. I used to go to police retirement parties all the time, and the police and I associated socially. I had many friends that were policemen, many friends that were detectives, and even though sometimes I represented mafia characters, I still had the respect of the police. They accepted me for doing my job. I accepted them for doing their job. We weren't enemies. But this changed, and it kept changing and changing as we got more professional police. They no longer were lawyers. They were warriors in the in the war against crime. So they started identifying with the police, and the police started identifying with themselves, and not as police should, but more like, the enemy's out there and everybody's the enemy, and we have to protect the citizenry, whoever they might be, from this enemy. So anybody that was from a lower economical status or a minority generally became a scumbag to the police. You hang out with police and they're referring a lot of people to scumbags. These are the criminals. They're not real people. They're the enemy. They're bad. And we can't do anything with bad people. The real unfortunate thing is with the pension plans, they didn't want to break the pension plans. And what they started doing was appointing judges from within. And generally, those were people that had paid into the state civil service for a number of years. They became judges because they could get their pension, and they would have paid into the pension fund more than somebody, say, such as me, who'd never at all worked for the government. If at an older age I became a judge, and say I was a judge 10 or 15 years, which used to be the lifespan until a judge got to be retirement age, that's not a hell of a lot of years to spend in the system to get a full retirement. So for a matter of economics, they needed to get a larger pool into the judge's retirement fund, even though it was all part of civil service. And this also happened when they started preying on pension funds. They let stockbrokers prey on the funds. When I was in law school, if you were a trustee, you were supposed to preserve the trust and marshal assets so that they could bring money back in, but you never ever risked the principal. And what happened I think it was mostly under the Reagan administration, they became very predatory, the stock market people, the brokers, financial planners, etc. And they would go to these poor, unsophisticated pension fund managers for the teachers groups or the unions or whatever. And they'd say, look, if you invested in the stock market instead of being here you would be here as far as the assets are concerned because the market was growing. They didn't talk about risk, so they would say, let us manage your funds. Well, the stock market goes up, the stock market goes down, and the brokers get their commissions both ways, but not so with the funds. So there started to be a little squeeze on some of the pension funds. Well, they then lobby for increasing the pools. Now, right now, had they not messed with the pension funds in the 70s and 80s, there would be a lot more money in the funds. They wouldn't count appreciation of assets as income, and you wouldn't have the bind that you've got today. But the bind then makes it almost virtually impossible for somebody who hasn't been a state employee for a number of years to become a judge, although it has happened. And the judges are pulled from the prosecutors. And the prosecutors view their clientele not as the public, but as the police, because they're the ones that go out and vote en masse. So you have these nice young prosecutors, all of a sudden they're made judges. They really had no experience with land problems, banking problems, domestic problems, other than prosecuting for domestic violence, I suppose. And they get a certain bias. And they lose a part of what the black people, or a lot of people would call their soul. I remember one case, my clients rode motorcycles and wore motorcycle garb, but they had semi-professional jobs, and they smoked marijuana, like a lot of other people. But they also had a child. Well, the one police department in Jefferson County decided these people were bikers. And in fact, one of my graduate students did his dissertation on the social construction of the term biker. Anyway, these people were bikers. They had a little baby, but the police decided they were scumbags, they were bad guys, they were dopers, even though they had middle-class jobs and seemed to be good parents, etc. But because they were bikers, they got branded as such somehow. So when the police raided them for their marijuana stashes, they used flashbang grenades. And when they raided the house, they threw the flashbang grenades into the bedroom. And in the bedroom, there were two children, one 6 months and one a year and a half. So when I was defending him in court, I mentioned to the one judge, I said, Judge, as you can see by the reports, these aren't really bad people. They're essentially middle-class suburban Americans that happen to like marijuana and smoke marijuana. There's no other criminal behavior. They hold jobs. They've had jobs. They've held them regularly over the years, and they have children. But the police threw flashbang grenades into the bedroom when they raided it, and one of the children now has a large-scale hearing loss, and the doctors don't know whether it's permanent or not, but it was caused by this stun grenade. The judge looks at me and he said, Mr. Blewett, your clients should have thought of that before they brought marijuana into their residence. Now, this doesn't connect. Because somebody violates a law doesn't mean that people in power can kick them, mistreat them, whatever. I don't care what they did or may have done. I don't think you punish the offspring. In fact, the Constitution talks about that. The inheritance of debt or whatever, inheritance of crime. The little baby wasn't a criminal. These people weren't violent. They threw the stun grenades in there because that's the way they rehearsed it, and that's the way they thought they should treat bikers, because bikers were undesirables. They hung out with other criminals and things like this. That is one of several stories of police abuse and things like that. So you look at abuse cases and the police department says, well, they were following their training or they're just following procedures. Nobody explains the procedures or the training. And I think that's what we've got to look at. How are these people trained? What are they expected of? In some nations, the police don't even carry weapons, and they're not in fear of their lives or in fear of danger. I've seen a lot of brutality cases or police shootings, for that matter, where an ordinary human would have not shot. Older policemen that I have known for years and are friends have told me they take pride in the fact they've never drawn their gun. But a lot of the young kids don't, because they think instead of working with citizens, they're working against scumbags, they're working against criminals, and the criminals are bad because they've been taught the criminals are bad, and they're bad enough that they need assault rifles and things like this. And this is done in the training and in the militarization of the training, where they're taught they got to be defending themselves all the time, that this is an enemy and not other citizens that happen to have been wrongdoers, and they're dangerous, even if they're accused or the evidence is of that. So although our system says people are presumed to be innocent, from the police point of view, that's bullshit. They're all guilty if they're suspect, and we treat them that way. We humiliate them when we arrest them, and we put on shows for the camera, shows for the newsmen, and show how we're safeguarding our citizenry, how we're protecting them from the scumbags of the country. And this is bad training. And I hate to use a family example, but my younger brother was in Air Search and Rescue Special Forces. He won 2 distinguished flying crosses. He flew where legally he wasn't supposed to be, so they classified them. And he was first off a member of a group they called the Green Hornets, and later he was one of the people, the founders of another unit they called Blue Light, which was overseas, counterterrorism. And when he retired, he talked to various vets clubs, Legion clubs, Rotary clubs, etc. And he was very, very adamantly against militarization of police. And he used to tell these people, you'd be very stupid to hire somebody like me as a policeman. I'm trained to kill, not make arrests. And I rescue people that were being under attack by enemies. So my orientation is completely different than what the civilian orientation of law enforcement should be. Well, of course, the wannabes didn't like to see that. They want to play soldiers. They want to attack people. They want to bully them. And that's what we have to change. You look at the way criminals are treated in other countries, or suspects, we'll call, and look at the way they're treated here. There's a big difference. Other countries don't seem to have the trouble with cops violating the law that we have here. But what we're doing is our culture is allowing a whole group to become above the law. One example, for instance, is they arrested a teacher in Jefferson County because he didn't report some sort of an assault. And the cops went in there, handcuffed him, hauled him out of the classroom in front of his students, and frog marched him down to the patrol car and took him away. This was an exercise of power. It was also an exercise of humiliation of a policeman. And it was done for the cameras and done for display purposes only. And I don't think this is the type of image we want. So when we talk about reforming police, let's get down to what are they teaching them in the police academies? How are they structuring their curriculum? What are they saying? What are they doing? What are they teaching these people? And we should look at that. We should look at the influence of law and order groups on the curriculum of policemen. I'll get into this later, but one thing we really should look at is the specialized officer, particularly in drug recognition. Their whole curriculum is bullshit, but nobody's challenging it. Think of the logic here. What would be the best test for a drunk driver? Is his blood got a certain amount of alcohol or marijuana or any other drug? Or does his breath show it, or his urine? Why not put him behind one of those game things or whatever they have with a steering wheel, and you put a quarter in it and you take the steering wheel and try to stay on the video road? I think that would be a good test of ability right there, rather than the test that they've come up with. Who cares how much somebody's drunk? It's whether or not he can handle the car, whether he can make decisions, whether or not he's thinking straight. And various people react in different ways. And we shouldn't have anybody over point something or 0.0 or 0.18 or whatever artificial number they come up with. That's really not evidence or proof of anything other than how much he's drunk. That doesn't prove that he's incapacitated or he can drive or not drive, or he's a danger to himself or the community, or has syphilis or something. Who the hell knows? But I think we've got to really look at what we're teaching these people. What kind of a culture do our police have? Is it a culture of kindness? Is it a culture of wanting to help people? Colorado used to have what they called the courtesy patrol, and all the cops carried a gallon or two of gas in case somebody ran out of gas. They would change tires for people. They would have a few soft drinks or water or whatever if they were dehydrated. But it was a courtesy patrol. Now, if you saw some outrageous conduct, you'd write a ticket. But your job wasn't just writing tickets and making revenue for the jurisdiction that you were working in. So think about this, and I'd like to hear some comments and maybe some arguments. I'd love that. Anyway, you guys have a good afternoon. Take it easy. Thank you.